Week we could call the Sunday Doubting Sunday, Sunday of doubt, because we heard the story of the doubting Thomas, and of course all about St. Thomas and how he wouldn't come to believe in the risen Christ until he himself saw with his own eyes and he touched the wounds with his hands. So last week was more about doubts. And I'd like to kind of name this Sunday Confusion Sunday. Confusion Sunday. And why do I say that? Because I think in this particular gospel story, it comes from Luke, the 24th chapter, we have two disciples, and they're a bit confused. They're a bit confused, and they truly are at that kind of point in this whole story where they just don't understand what has truly taken place and what it's all about and what it means, and, probably even questioning their own belief. So they were confused. But what I want to do is I want to draw something out for you in this particular gospel that kind of maybe draws us into the story as these two disciples. I always like to look at it and say it kind of has a Shakespearean twist to it. And what do I mean by that is that, Shakespeare was a brilliant writer, and he didn't write just for the day, just for his time. All of his writings, and trust me, I don't claim to be a Shakespearean expert, and like I said last night, half the time I've seen one of his plays or I've read one of the books, I usually scratch my head and say, sometimes it's difficult, but Shakespeare's way was to not just write about the day, but to write something that would live on. He touched the human spirit. He wrote about just human experience. He wrote about death and dying and deceit and lies and cheating and success. He wrote about all those things, but in his writing, he drew people into the story so that they could find themselves in their lives into those same experiences of what he wrote about. Well, I think St. Luke does the same thing. It isn't like St. Luke was writing and saying, well, these are the facts of the day, and I want you to understand what happened that day. I think St. Luke definitely draws us to a point where we see ourselves. We see ourselves in the story. We see ourselves in the journey. We see ourselves in that same confusion and that same wonder. Now, of course, let's look at this story a little bit. You've got two disciples. St. Luke only names one of them, Cleopas, all right? Yes, the other one could have been his wife, Mary, okay? Some scholars look at it and say, well, at the cross we hear about the Marys that were there, and one of them was who? The wife of Cleopas, and another part of John's gospel, it mentions that he's probably, the brother of St. Joseph, Cleopas was. So maybe it was his wife that was walking along with him, but St. Luke leaves that out, for a couple different reasons. Maybe it's because, I'm sorry, women, but a woman's name wasn't that as important at that time. It was important to name the man, but maybe he left it out for another reason. So he's got these two disciples walking along. I want you to know something. Where are they walking to? They're walking to Emmaus. They're walking away from Jerusalem. All right? Now, Jerusalem for the Hebrew people, for the Jewish people, was a very important place because it represented God. It represented the presence of God. Their celebrations and feasts that took place in Jerusalem, whenever they were seeking out to celebrate their faith and focus on their faith, they were focused on Jerusalem, and they were going to Jerusalem. So what does St. Luke do? He has them going away from Jerusalem. They're turning their back on that holy place, that place where they celebrated their faith. They're turning their back, in some sense, on their faith. And in turning their back on the faith, they meet up with confusion. Isn't that something that we sometimes experience too when we turn our backs to God? And then we begin to question and we begin to wonder and we begin to really question our belief, or is God real? Is God really active? Is God really helping me? Something else in that story I think is important too to bring out is that, what do they say? They start recounting the story. They start, saying something to this man that's walking with them. And at the last part of them telling the story, they said, we hoped that he was the one. We had hope that he was the one that was going to redeem us. He was the one that was going to free us. He was the one that was going to be the one to lead us. That was our hope. All right, so let's look at this hope, because they had the wrong idea, right? They had the wrong idea. Their hope is that this person, this Messiah, was going to raise them up. He was going to be a militant leader. He was going to raise them against, the Roman Empire and lead Israel back to prominence. Their hope was focused in the wrong direction. Their hope was more selfish. Their hope was more self-centered. And because that was self-centered and it was more focused on what they wanted, that's where they got confused. And in that confusion, what did they miss out on? They missed out on who was walking with them. They didn't recognize them. Because of their selfishness, because of their focus being in the wrong direction, they didn't realize that Jesus was right there. And it took them to sit down and have a meal. And I love the words that are used that St. Luke uses there. That's the early part of the Mass right there, where he took the bread, he broke it, he blessed it, and he gave it to them. And then all of a sudden their eyes were open. But what did they do at that point? Obviously Jesus vanished. That's a whole nother story. But they went back to Jerusalem. They put their focus in the right direction. I think St. Luke is really saying, let's find ourselves in this story. Because there are so many times in our journey to wherever we're going, that we turn away from God and we lose that hope, or we get confused. We hope for great things in our lives. Easter weekend, as I was, Friday or Saturday, I don't remember what it was. I was at the store, getting something, and I thought, I'm going to buy a lottery ticket. Because I'm hoping, God, all this church I'm putting in this week, I'm hoping, God, that just maybe, you're going to help me out. I'm going to find some wealth. I'm hoping. I realized that wasn't the hope that I needed. But I do remember Easter night. Easter night, I sat at my house, and there with all my kids and their spouses or their significant others, my wonderful, beautiful granddaughter, my almost-to-be grandchild coming hopefully this week or next. I know Megan can't wait. But I sat there, and I looked, and I thought to myself, my hope for wealth was in the wrong direction. Oh, yeah, it'd make life easy, wouldn't it? But my true wealth is when I sat there, and I honestly, just a tear came to my eyes, because I just thank God for my family. And I just watched as my kids, they joked and they laughed and they just told stories, because that's what we do. But I realized the blessing, and I just said, thank you, God, because I'm wealthier than anything because of this experience of family. I remember when my mom was going through her illness. She passed from Alzheimer's a couple of years back, and anybody that's experienced that, they know the challenges of that. And of course, my hope and my prayer was always, just make my mom better, God, please. Come on. Again, I'm a church-going guy, God. I read the Bible. I pray a lot. Why don't you do this for me? My hope was for that to change. But it didn't. But then my hope was focused in a different direction, where I focused on Jesus, where I focused on my faith. And I just remember the strength that was given in those last days, the strength that was given to be able to face that challenge. And I, again, sat back, and I'll never forget the 4 days from the day she passed to the day that we celebrated her funeral. My family and I, we had a good time. That doesn't sound right, does it? Experience the death of my mother and just, together. But we just gave thanks because we had such a good time being together, telling stories, celebrating my mom's life, celebrating her faith, of course, that faith that gave us strength. My brothers and sisters, St. Luke is really pointing us in a direction, and he's telling us, don't turn your back on God. Yes, we have our hope. And of course, I know sometimes it isn't always what we want. But I can tell you the hope that God gives is the hope that we need. And that's what's so important. That's what's so important. Every time that we kind of turn our back on God, I think that's when we find ourselves in confusion. He doesn't want us to be confused, and he's trying to make it easy on us by saying, always face towards Jesus. Always give it to Jesus. Always draw yourself to Jesus, because guess what? In this story, what does he do? When you're there with him and you're facing him, he draws himself closer to you. He draws himself closer to you. So whoever that second disciple is, we can question, we can debate, we don't know for sure. But I think St. Luke purposely left out the name for a reason. Because I can tell you the name of that disciple. The name of that disciple, the one was Cleopas, the other name of that disciple was Ron. It was Leah. It was Mike. It was Nancy. It was Carmen. It was John. But what he's telling us today is he's saying, don't get confused. Don't look in the wrong direction. See me. Face me. Give it to me. I can tell you today is when you do that, when you come to this table today and we receive him in the Eucharist, you're going to be overwhelmed with the power and the grace and the love and the compassion of Christ, because in that bread, it is the body. In that wine is the blood. You'll recognize him. And I can promise you, your life will change. So keep walking in the right direction. Don't walk away from him. Walk in the right direction.